And welcome everybody to the 4Bs on the American Constitution or in American life. Although in our last segment we told you we had finished our kind of formal coverage of the national questions, we actually have a teacher request this week, and that is to cover the issue of polarization, political polarization, money and politics, campaign finance reform, and what I call the decline of the American Republic here. And so, and we are again very honored to have a guest with us. This is Associate Professor Paul Nolette from Marquette University, which for you young kids used to actually be a basketball powerhouse, but once McGuire retired, I don't know if they've won 10 games in a season after that.
Well, we got Shaka Smart now, so hey, we're coming back.
That's right, baby. He's back home.
So, as I said, we're going to be talking about a couple of different topics, and hopefully we can build a bridge through them. It's interesting, before we started our Zoom, we were talking about polarization kind of in a lot of different institutions, and some of the issues that are really good representations of that modern polarization: mask mandate, vaccinations, election reform, Dr. Seuss, infrastructure, bipartisanship, and on and on. According to Michelle Cottle of the New York Times, we are not only divided as Americans, our polarization has led to the development of two different languages. So we want to talk about both a little bit of historical background, causation, and if any way, some remedies to that, as well as is there any connective tissue between polarization and money and politics. So let me ask you, Dr. Nolette, in a political system like ours, which is based on separated powers, division of powers, and has this two-party tradition, the idea of division is at the core of our system, it seems. So is this notion of polarization really as bad as some people portray it to be? I mean, aren't we supposed to be polarized, or wasn't the system designed because they knew we were going to be polarized?
Well, you know, it's interesting because, like you say, our political institutions are very much divided: separation of powers and federalism and different power sources in different areas. But a lot of what makes that work is, you know, compromise. I think the system really is built to encourage compromise and to encourage you know, the parties, and of course we've had a two-party dominant system really since the start. It's there to kind of push the parties to compromise and to come to agreement. And that is reflected in the fact that, you know, look, it's not all that common where one party controls everything, you know, controls the House, the Senate, and the presidency. We sort of have that now, but it doesn't last terribly long. And even when one party controls in Washington, you have parties controlling in the states, and they're really important to governance as well. So some level of compromise, I think, needs to be there. And so polarization in some ways doesn't necessarily fit all that well with the divided nature of our institutions, because it can lead to gridlock, it can lead to frustration, and, you know, a feeling that government can't do anything. So that's one concern, that the, you know, onset of a deeper and broader polarization these days, I think, is a potential danger.
Well, I'm wondering to the rest of you, what is the danger? All right, if indeed this is some kind of, you know, dark, evil polarization, what is the danger of this situation we're in to our constitutional republic?
People storming the Capitol, trying to overthrow a free and fair election. I'll throw that out there. I mean,
well, you could try a little less sarcasm when you do throw it out there, okay?
Yeah, well,
I think I'll weigh in on this one. I think this notion, I think the scholars correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, they call it
Oh, you say scholars, you
effective
go with the Paul.
polarization.
Okay, I see.
Right, yeah, absolutely, because I'm looking around. I spent too much time with you guys to I know better. But I think all the political scientists call this effective polarization, and it seems like they're configuring that notion to be it's because people their politics is so deeply embedded in their personhood. It's an identity thing. So if that is the case, that like if I'm a Democrat or if I'm a Republican, that's so deeply embedded in my understanding of the world and who I am, to compromise equals a compromise of who I am. So I mean, I guess as you explained our situation, Paul, I wondered whether it's even possible for compromise if this idea of effective polarization is true. The compromise seems to run antithetical to your existence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think that that's a good point, that you sometimes hear the phrase identity politics, and that can mean a few different things, that there's an increasing division on racial or gender lines or other demographic lines, but also political party. Like you say, there's a deeper identity with being a conservative or liberal or Democrat, Republican. And I think one of the problems too, to add to that, is the onset of really kind of a deeper negative polarization too. So what's been sort of interesting, as polarization has increased over the past several years, it hasn't necessarily been because people say, well, my party is even better than I thought it was 10 years ago. It's more that the other party is worse than I thought 10 years ago. And so there's increased hatred and distrust of the other party, which I think in many ways makes compromise more difficult, because how do you trust somebody? If you don't trust somebody, it's going to be very difficult to compromise and come to agreement on anything. But also it's kind of like, oh, I'm negotiating with the devil. Right. If you literally think the other side stands for the destruction of America and the destruction of American values, it's going to be hard to say, well, yeah, you have to go shake their hand and come up with a solution together. It's going to be really difficult. So I think that's where we're kind of at, and where I see polarization and the way that polarization has developed as ultimately being a negative, because it's fine if people disagree. You bring a bunch of different views to the table, but it's developed in a way that just makes it really difficult to even talk with one another, never mind actually come to a political compromise.
Professor Williams, you have some thoughts on this, on like the general danger here?
Yeah, I do. And I think I agree with Chris and Paul and Tim and everyone here in that to me, the danger is that most Americans want a government that's going to work, that's going to solve some problems. And I think, I know we're going to talk later maybe about where the source of this polarization is, if we're talking about it. But, a lot of Americans are in the middle. And for me, the danger is when Republicans and Democrats who are in Congress, when they're so polarized that they cannot compromise, to get to Paul's point, and then there are issues that are not getting resolved, it just has this feedback effect where people start losing trust in government. And one of the consequences of that is that people don't participate, either vote or just do some other basic civic responsibilities. And the other danger is what Chris alluded to, that people get so angry, they start turning to other forms of political expression that most Americans would probably say is not part of our political culture. But we saw on January 6th that for extreme members of our society, they are part of the political culture. So I think that's where the danger is. It's not getting things done, and then the consequences of that for both the moderates, those in the middle, and those on the extremes.
Well, I'm curious to the two political scientists here. In high school, which is my experience for the most part, government textbooks, when they talked about political identification, political parties, they talk about the great American political consensus. That and we had a lot of activities for kids to kind of identify themselves. And I remember, one of those lessons that I did, one of the purposes was to show them, especially if you did kind of an issue-oriented thing, that most of them are going to find themselves in the middle. And you seem to be saying, Mike, that that's still the case. Is it really? After the 2020 election, do you really believe that most Americans are in the middle? And that's also to you, Paul, or to anybody, but Mike, you first. I'm just curious, do you really believe?
Yeah, this is not my area of expertise, so I look forward to see what others say, but I kind of agree with Morris Fiorina's argument that he continues to make, that yes, on most important political issues or significant political issues, most Americans kind of are in agreement. I just saw a poll that 75% of Americans think that the federal government should have a mask mandate, right? Most Americans, up to 70%, believe in some sort of gun restrictions. Most Americans believe that abortion should, not be completely legal or completely illegal. And that where the polarization is occurring is within the political parties and with political elites. And we can maybe talk more about why that's the case. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but I know there's a robust debate, and I tend to think that still in the middle, but it's the political parties that have kind of sorted to the extremes. But I could be dissuaded from that for sure.
Professor Nolette?
Yeah, and I think that's been one of the big debates for quite some time now, is really that distinction between elite polarization, which means like political leaders, senators, representatives, governors, and mass polarization. So really the people who might be Democratic or Republican and they're members of those parties. And there has been this argument that actually what we've been seeing is more of an elite polarization phenomenon as opposed to one that's mass polarization. I do think, there's something to that for sure. As Mike mentioned, even on really issues that we consider really deep cultural issues like guns, there's a lot of agreement on things like background checks and, banning of assault weapons and, things like that get wide agreement even across the parties. But at the same time, I do think elite polarization, and including as media kind of polarizes too, that can, there's some trickle down effect, if you want to use that term, some trickle down to the mass polarization. And a lot of people take their cues from political leaders. So, President Trump was kind of famous for not being pretty flexible on a lot of policy issues and not necessarily having a clear policy vision. But when he did articulate a policy vision, a lot of Republicans or Republican identifying people kind of moved along with him. And same thing is true on the Democratic side. One good example of that I remember was when, during the Obama administration, when first Joe Biden as vice president and then President Obama said that they supported same-sex marriage. It actually, when they declared that, it had a big impact on the percentage of Democrats who then supported same-sex marriage. Like it jumped considerably once they did that. So I think the elites can actually have an impact on how people think about issues. So it's not necessarily set in stone.
Chris, you had raised your hand initially. What's your insights?
I was going to push back on Mike a little bit, because I think that where we used to be, where you could draw a circle around the middle, right? If you look at, political scales, right? Where most Americans were, but over time, and I've seen this really good one, it shows over time just is starting to pull apart. And now you actually see the polarization within this graphic as it starts to pull folks apart and people become more polarized and there's less movement. There's less people in the middle. And I think it goes back to, I think what Tim was saying, the idea, and Paul even alluded to, identity politics, but it's also my identity is defined by my politics. Yeah. And the idea of being able to compromise I used to use a piece with when John Boehner was the Speaker of the House, and it was an interview he'd given on 60 Minutes, and he said compromise was a dirty word. The idea that, you know, I'm going to sit down with, as Paul said, the enemy here, because that's just bad. That's just bad for me. So of course that just drives people further apart because there's less idea of compromise. And for the students watching, compromise and common ground are not the same things. Make sure you understand that. Common ground is not the same as compromise. Common ground is when you can agree on, both sides can agree on one thing and you find one spot to stand. Nobody has to give up anything. So make sure you don't confuse those two. I have a question though, going back to the idea of elite polarization. Do you think it's the elites driving the bus, or are they merely responding to the base? Does that make, you know, it's a chicken and egg kind of thing. I don't mean, because I think like, you know, you listen to some people spew some stuff, and I'll use that word spew, and you think, how can you actually believe this or think this? Are they simply pandering? And then by that pandering, does that create the you know, that circular kind of, I don't know what I'm thinking here, but the idea that it just continues.
No, I understand where you're going. And again, I hate to say it, but especially during the Trump years. I mean, if you look at core, and again, Boehner's book and the interviews, you know, Boehner says he would not get elected in the Republican Party, and referred that, you know, Reagan probably wouldn't get elected in the modern Republican Party today, you know, and so in that sense, I fully understand where you're going there. Chris, Dr. Nolette, what are your thoughts to Chris's insight?
It's tough because, right, I mean, it's interesting how when a lot of politicians talk off the record, they'll say, oh, you know, I hate how politics is today. And, you know, they're willing to criticize their own party and say, yeah, I wish we could work together. But then when they're on, you know, they're in front of a camera or they're talking to constituents, it's like, nope, they just bring the fire and brimstone. And that, you know, that kind of leans maybe towards the idea that they are kind of pandering in a sense. And maybe, you know, part of it, and this kind of gets to maybe the money in politics piece too, but is that even if a lot of people are in the middle still, it's like the people that are driving the train, you know, the party activists, they are more extreme than ever. They're the ones giving the money. They're the ones voting 100% in every primary, and, you know, going out there with signs and going to town halls and yelling at people. I mean, so I think in some ways it's like, who do you pay more attention to? The moderate who never contacts your office and doesn't say a word, or the activist who's calling you every day saying, how are you going to vote on this bill? If you vote this way, then I will never forgive you, never give you any money, and I'm going to campaign against you. Like, you're probably going to be like, oh, you know, that person seems like somebody I should really pay attention to. And as the extremes on the activist side get more extreme, you know, that might be really driving the train. So it's kind of like a, you know, like a compromise view maybe between the mass polarization and the elite polarization, that there's a big group within the general public who nevertheless are just much more vocal and much more polarized.
Well, in my reading and thinking about this, I came up with, my observation is that this is the fourth period of significant polarization, and working backwards, I think we would all agree late 60s, 1968 to 1971 being a really tough period there. Obviously, the antebellum, the 1850s up until Fort Sumter there. And my third one, and this is where I'm going to turn to Mr. Moore, it's the 1790s, Tim. Would you call that a polarized period?
I think, yeah. As Paul and Chris were fleshing out this idea of elite polarization versus mass polarization, I think there might be something to that when you apply it to the 1790s. I mean, because, you know, take Hamilton off the table. Everybody else, they know each other.
I think Burr did take him off the table.
Yeah,
Too
but-
soon.
yeah. But I think there is something to this notion that in the 1790s, they know each other. They've been through. They've got a lot of mileage, and they're going to fight tooth and nail. But there's an element of trust amongst the elites. Now, once we get towards the election of 1800, all hell breaks loose when the lowbrows get involved in the newspaper wars of calling each other's candidates all kinds of interesting things. So there might be something to this. Elites don't polarize as quickly as the masses do. So I think there might be something to that on the 1790s.
Well, I don't know if there's another time that anybody wants to reference. I struggled with whether the Jackson years were polarized or not. But what explains the current polarization? And I'd like to dig deep on this topic. How would you guys explain why we're where we are today? Chris, and try not to be that sarcastic.
I have a phrase. I've got a phrase. I did a little reading in presentism. I took a shower right afterwards, but I love this phrase. I read a couple of articles. High choice media environments. That seemed to show up in several of the articles I read. Okay, so I hear, all right, it's cable news is the bad guy on this. So I mean, I saw it in a couple of these pieces that I read. I mean, is that a fair? They went to some other things, but that always was like number one. I mean, is that fair?
Well, media in general is obviously one of the core factors here. I think since we've all lived it, the birth of Fox News as a contrast to CNN and then MSNBC coming along, that cable has added, their certain elements to this. Social media probably has then upped it, up the ante, tenfold, or the intensity tenfold there. So I would agree that media plays a major significant role, but that's also true in the 1790s. That's true in the 1850s. That's true, not as quick, not as swiftly, but I think it's true that media during these polarization periods plays a role. Am I right or wrong on that to the general group here?
I think that's right, David, when you talk about through history. But I think today, with 67 to 70% of their people getting their news from Facebook, and then we know that we've been played by foreign powers, planting information that just is pouring gasoline on the already smoldering fire. So I want Tim, in that great phrase you had there, does that include Facebook? Does that include social media, or is that simply?
I think so. And how these particular authors were framing it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I just remember being in DC one time and hanging out with Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein, our boys from the Broken Branch, and it's even worse than it looks, and two political scientists that have been around DC for a long time. And during a break in the presentation, I asked them, this is a number of years ago, I said, I want to go back to my students, and I want to be able to tell them what we seem to be starting on this path. And this is maybe early 2000s.
Yeah, it's 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Close.
And so they both, and this was kind of like off the cuff, both without even conferring with each other, said Newt Gingrich. And they mentioned, they told this story about how they would have dinner off the record with people in the freshman class they identified as kind of movers and shakers. Just they want to check in on their careers through follow them, right? And Newt was one of those folks. And this is before even Speaker of the House. And they were having dinner, and he said something. Of course, this is through them telling me that even shocked his Republican colleagues, and that he was willing to destroy the institution in order to maintain party dominance. The idea that you start to begin to see this demonization of opponents. right? You start to see lawmakers spend less time together in DC and more time back in their district or more time with donors. And so if you're talking about the beginnings or the origins, that was an interesting description by those guys, and moving forward to like the contract.
Well, and there's no doubt. I mean, about that, and the chaos that Gingrich wanted to bring, not only to the Congress as a whole, meaning the Democrats, but also to his own party. Remember, he raised hell, and Boehner's been talking about that in the last week. One of the things, don't you think that, and this kind of goes back to something Paul said earlier, about the shifting sands of political alignment and ideology in American history, that you may have single party rule, but for not very long. But one of the things that seems to me to explain this is the anger, bitterness, resentment on behalf of Republicans, because Democrats controlled Congress for how long? I mean, we're going back to the New Deal into the 1990s, that the Democratic Party controls the House of Representatives. And I think we could all agree that they played some games with that power. They may have abused that power. And one way that Gingrich is able to rise so quickly is to build on that resentment of single party rule in Congress for nearly 50 years. Thoughts, insights? Crickets?
Yeah.
Well,
no, go ahead, Chris.
Well, I don't want to take us in a different course, but there's another article I read about this, and I know this is a PG-13 show, but it's called the shit life syndrome, right? So when you live in a small rural community, and you start to see businesses move out, and these old main streets that used to be vibrant main streets in these smaller rural communities are now just all boarded up. There's opportunities have gone by the wayside, especially for a certain demographic. You start to see people, and we see this with our life expectancy, right? Our life expectancy for white folks has gone down as opposed to gone up. And so you see an increase in meth, you see an increase in suicide. They call it the shit life syndrome. And so when you live in a situation like that, and someone comes along, and we know this through history, we know this to be true, that when someone comes along, I'll say a demagogue, and points at somebody to blame for that, it makes it easier to get people fired up as well. So it was an interesting piece on talking about what they call the shit life syndrome.
And that, as particularly thinking about how the parties are constructed too. I mean, you have this growing gulf between certainly rural and urban communities where, it's really kind of remarkable. You have a lot of rural areas that have been sort of stuck. You have jobs leaving, not coming back. The opioid crisis has sort of taken a back seat to COVID, but it's still there, very much so, and takes thousands of lives every year, and particularly in rural areas. Meanwhile, the economic growth has largely been in urban areas, and so that discrepancy continues, and especially given that some of the cultural values in urban and rural areas is also so, so disparate at this point. I think that some of that resentment, perhaps on both sides, really kind of helps to fire up polarization even more, especially as Democrats become more of an urban party and Republicans more of a rural party.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to bring up again, since the Democratic Republic started in 1964, we should maybe start there. And I'm being a little bit facetious. We've been joking around about when actually America has become a liberal democracy. I keep making the argument it didn't come until 64, 65 because of civil rights.
You're not alone.
I know. But seriously to the students, at that point, you could argue there were still cleavages in American society and differences among the parties, but the Democrats actually had moderates and they had conservatives in their party, and the Republicans had liberals, right? And what we see after the 64 and 65 Voting Rights Act, the very next election is all about the Southern strategy. And there is a particular party realignment that to me is the starting point in terms of our political institutions. It starts there. Then we start having direct primaries for those running for Congress, which then adds into it something a little different. So to me, the central political cleavage, the cultural cleavage in the United States has always been around race. It's what divided it divided folks in Philadelphia, it divided the parties, it's divided us throughout our history. And that to me is the beginning of the Southern strategy. It's the beginning of Reaganism, it's the attack on welfarism, it's the attack on programs meant to help the poor, which was code language for Blacks and other non-whites, whether percentage-wise it was actually helping more whites, we know that. And to me, the rise of Newt Gingrich and the rise of President Trump is all coming from that. And then the final thing I'll say is what changed, for me, the two things that, the big structural things happening amongst this is the stagnation of wages beginning in the 70s and 80s and the end of the Cold War in 1992, when then all pretenses of having to pretend like there's this big enemy we have to be worried about internationally is gone. And that's the rise of Clinton and Gingrich. Again, I'm not an expert. I'm really showing off how little I know about this, Paul, so you can come in and correct me on this, but I see it starting in the 60s and then everything after that kind of stemming off. But I know that's super simplistic as well.
No, and in fact, I think that there's really something to that. If we look back at, we've talked about Gingrich in the 90s and that really kind of sparking a new era of polarization. That also, the 94 elections, which of course, famously the Republicans took over the House of Representatives for the first time in decades, but it also was a real sea change on the state level. The traditionally Democratic Deep South, that was really the year that was kind of broken, and really broke the Democrats in many of these areas. And then, it took a few more years after that for Republicans to really take control of, states like Kentucky and such. But that was really the period where the parties really started losing. The Democrats lost their conservatives and, the Republicans lost their liberals. And in a two-party system where you don't have this huge range of parties that represent, the far right kind of like communist parties, and then the far or far right like fascist parties, far left communist parties, like you see in some European countries, like the two-party system is supposed to have some diversity, I would think, in ideology in order for it to work well. But if they both become so super polarized, then it's not, it is kind of unlike what we've seen elsewhere in American history, where those parties have had a pretty diverse range of ideologies within the parties themselves. And it's much less that way since the 60s, but then, especially since the 90s when the historic ties, to the Democratic Party in some areas really started loosening and falling apart.
Professor Moore, I thought you wanted to say something, but maybe I was reading your body language.
Yeah, well, the idea of anger and resentment. I swim around in the evangelical world a fair amount, and I guess I can kind of, and this kind of was confirmed in a conversation I had with a very dear friend who's he's a right-wing nutbag, but he's a dear friend, and so we were talking about this last night, and I think it just kind of confirmed something in me that a lot of evangelicals are very angry and very fearful. And I think when you have evangelicals that tend to see the world in very, I'm gonna get real old, I'm gonna get real nerdy here, but there's this notion, philosophy of Manichaeism, where there's like light and dark, that the world is in stark good and evil, light and dark, enemy, friend. There's no, and I think a lot of evangelicals are prone to that old ancient philosophy of Manichaeism. And it really, I mean, it didn't take much to get evangelicals very fearful and certainly angry since Roe. And that's been a long festering anger amongst evangelicals. So I think the stark contrast of good and evil, I think, feeds into a resentment faction within the conservative side of politics. Now, I can't speak to the fear and anger that occurs on the left, but I think with evangelicals on the right, it's a religious framework of good and evil, and there's no middle ground that causes this fear and resentment.
Well, I'm curious, Tim, since you kind of brought it up. I mean, we've identified, the two-party system and its structure and the changes it went through late 60s and also in the 90s. We've talked about the rural urban, which has been with us for at least 200 years. That divide, identity politics. I'm glad that Professor Williams brought up race, because I think that has to be considered as maybe a core issue. But I found a couple of articles this week about the decline in religious identity and the percentage of people who go to religious services. And that contributes to some of the fear amongst the more fundamentalist evangelical groups of the decline of Christianity. And also, with that decline in Christianity, government in some ways has become the institution to replace that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there's an idolatry. And I said this last night in the conversation I had. I said, to me, I mean, it's funny to me that to talk to another evangelical, and I said, sounds to me like you have an idolatry problem, because your politics has become co-equal or more superior than your God. So I think it is an idolatry problem.
How do you respond to that, Tim?
Well, I'm lucky that he's a friend.
Clearly, you guys are friends, and I don't want you to betray that trust, but I mean, I'm curious how someone like that would respond to that observation.
Well, I mean, the short answer, Chris, was yes. I used to not have politics be so central to and he used the word, my essence, as it is now. And I fear that it has to be to save the country. So I think there's this notion of, and I think there's some Christian America, there's some of that in there too. But I think there's a fear, and that fear is really, the way I sense it, drives a lot of that particular, I call it the fear faction of the Republican Party.
Well, we saw, if you look at the, back to the January 6th,
yeah,
and you look at a lot of the flags or signage or symbolism in the crowd there.
Yep.
A lot of that was heavily religious, heavily, evangelical or Christian based symbolism within that crowd. And back to, I think, what Paula said earlier, the idea they're fighting for the triumph of good over evil. So,
well, and I think there is something to the religious part, especially since evangelicals, of course, have identified much closer with the Republican Party, and we're really President Trump's biggest backers. But I think in a lot of ways it goes even beyond that. And I'm thinking about that kind of contemporary classic, I would call it, in political science, Kathy Kramer's book, The Politics of Resentment, which was, she did these really interesting interviews of rural Wisconsinites. So here in my, home state here. And she found that the real connecting tissue there was resentment. I mean, that's why she titled her book, The Politics of Resentment. And Wisconsin is actually one of the lower evangelical states, in terms of people who identify as particularly religious or evangelical. But nevertheless, even among people who weren't particularly religious, there was that real sense of resentment towards Madison and Milwaukee, the urban centers, resentment that they were losing something, like their America is going and going to be gone soon. So I think, part of it is perhaps like religion plays into it in that it's like religion is something you can't compromise, right? But it's even true amongst people who aren't particularly religious too. Yeah,
I have a
which is
pub
interesting.
that I go to occasionally down the street, Paul, the Lincoln Tap. That's where I go to see the resentments.
Yeah.
Can I ask, are you getting paid, Tim, for every time you mention the Lincoln Pub?
No, I should. Yeah, let me put all those guys onto our discussions. They'll love it.
Yeah.
Dr. Williams?
Yeah, I wanted to do a Chris Kavanaugh. I'm not sure if any of you have read The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. It's not a political science book. It's a social psychology book. And I'd recommend the students take a look at it because it gets at this issue of religion, and it gets more at the issue as, instead of explaining why we're where we at, it's like, how do we get out of it? Like, how do you talk to someone who is fundamentally different from you in terms of polarization? And Haidt's main argument is that while we like to tell ourselves that reason is what guides our discussion, it's not, right? It's our moral intuitions that are really guiding things, and we make up arguments to defend what we already believe. So in terms of thinking about how you talk to someone that has a fundamentally different view than you, he gives some good sort of ideas here about how you can't argue your way in those situations. You have to talk about people's values and what they think is worthy, and have the conversation from there. Sounds like kind of what Tim was just modeling, what he was doing with his good friend last night, not trying to convince him of facts, but just to understand where he's at in terms of his moral compass on this stuff. So
Tim, didn't you share a podcast with us weeks ago of a woman that was doing this, African-American woman, older woman, civil rights worker, been involved in stuff and not trying to win people over and how to do that? Did you share that?
I don't think that was me.
Okay. I don't know. I thought it was one of you guys because it was really good, but she did, the same kind of idea. How do you sit down with folks that are polar opposite than you and come to some type of dialogue without, just wanting to set the other on fire?
So I just want to, before we transition to, again, hopefully a bridge topic, I'm just wondering to what degree, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being major there, to what degree is gerrymandering played a role in the current polarization of America there, Paul? I mean, is it a 10? Gerrymandering is a major contributor to polarization, a 5, a 2? What's your thoughts about that?
I'd actually say something like a 2. I actually don't think gerrymandering is a particularly big piece of this. And I mean, maybe the clearest evidence there is that, sure, we've seen the House of Representatives get very polarized, but we've seen the US Senate get super polarized. And that's not gerrymandered, that's states. And then we've seen state legislatures, and granted, a lot of them are gerrymandered, but we've seen them get very polarized. We've seen governors get polarized. We've seen attorneys general get polarized. Like, everyone's getting polarized. And so, I think maybe there's a little bit there in that, if you create safe seats, then maybe you're especially worried about the primaries and you listen even more to the extreme voices in your party. But I think overall, it's low on my list for the causes of polarization.
I would go back to, and I've said this before, so this is, the idea of when you have a winner take all system, when you have that system, and you're inevitably, and that's my boy Duverger, right? Duverger's law. When you have a winner take all, you're going to inevitably just have 2 parties. And Paul spoke to this earlier. You don't have those. We've moved away from those nuances within parties. We've moved away from those factions within parties because of party purity. The idea that you're a rhino kind of idea. So I think it's actually not. I think gerrymandering, I'd probably give that a 4 as opposed to a 2, but I think I would go even further in terms of looking at when you have a winner take all system that we have with the Electoral College. I think that inevitably is going to limit the ideas that we end up with on the table.
I'm kind of shocked, especially, those of you from Wisconsin. I mean, isn't Wisconsin one of the, and I can't remember how many sessions ago somebody mentioned it. You look at your districts and, like 60% of the people are in 30% of the districts or something like that. There, it seems to me that that's played a major role, because that creates the resentment on the other side.
Well, and just to be clear, I think gerrymandering is a huge problem. It's not that I think it's like a 2 in terms of not mattering that much. I think it matters a lot because it completely distorts votes and causes a lot of problems. I just don't know if it has much of a link to polarization. I think there are other causes that are really leading to that. But gerrymandering is a problem for sure, for a number of reasons dealing with democracy.
Okay, so using the same scale, Paul, what about money? Where do you put money in politics as far as a contributing factor?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a little bit higher. I might say like a 4 or a 5. And again, I think it has to do with the fact that it is perhaps the more politically motivated extremes that are more likely to donate money and to participate in that way. The reason I don't have it even a little bit higher than that is because we've even seen in the last couple of elections, certainly if you look at the presidential election, that money in politics definitely matters, but it's not the whole game. Trump raised a lot less money in 2016 and still won. The Democrats were blowing the Republicans out of the water in 2020, but they had a decent election, but not a great one. I think at a certain point, once you go from $0 to your first $1 million, that really matters. Once you go from $1 million to 10 million, that matters a little bit. But once you get into like $1 billion, your next $1 billion isn't going to buy you a whole lot more. So it kind of has like a diminishing returns over time.
Billion here, billion there. Pretty soon we're talking about real money.
Yeah.
But I'm going to push back just a little bit. Sorry, guys, let me jump in, because I think that you still see, the former president, Trump, is a player only because he's able to raise that kind of money, right? This is why I think you don't see a lot of the, I want to say, sober-minded Republicans fleeing from him, is because he has the ability to continue to raise that money, even if it's illegally, by continuing to drain your bank account, because you didn't read the fine print. So I think there's a reason that people have gone down to Mar-a-Lago to kiss his ring, because they still think that he can raise a lot of coin for them.
Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on which aspect we're going to talk about here. I mean, there is the ability to give the money, and then there's the ability for the political elites to spend the money. So for example, there's like the United Kingdom. There's no limits on what people can give to candidates and political parties, United Kingdoms, but there's real tight limits on how it can be spent, which sets up an incentive where they don't need to raise a lot of money. What am I talking about here? They're not like public television is free. Every political party gets an ad that they get to put on, so there's no spending there. And they don't need to, they have a limited window on when the election takes place, so it's not like these drawn out elections. So I think if we think about the role of money in terms of why do American politicians need to spend so much? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on this, I think 70% of most campaign funding goes to pay for TV, right? So if we, I don't, maybe this is not a problem in people giving the money to Donald Trump. And maybe this is all gone now with Twitter and Facebook. Maybe this whole argument's blown out of the water. But if we had some sort of public financing and that it was free to advertise and there were limits on that, maybe the money wouldn't have such a corrosive effect. I don't know. It's just an idea.
To your point, Chris, I find it fascinating. And again, I think we're also possibly in a period of political realignment here, is that one, the Trump, world has has challenged the RNC, and told people don't donate to them, donate to, whatever the name of his campaign is. And the last reporting, the Trump people had raised as much as the RNC there. So, again, there's this internal battle going on, and again, a redefinition maybe of the Republican Party because of that. But I am curious, Paul, I know you're a political science, not a historian, but the two do cross over. We try to convince Professor Williams of that all the time. But at what point in our history did money become a noticeable problem? And Mr. Moore, maybe you can chime in. I'm just wondering, did the framers and the first, did they have any sense about money in politics being a problem?
Oh, sure. And Governor George Clinton was Exhibit A on that. I mean, he controlled the New York politics. Now, so the same problem is there, but I mean, is it so different now in terms of scale? Yeah, I can't imagine they would be able to see the amount of money now, but they're aware of it. They're definitely aware of it.
And I think a lot of the big concerns was about direct corruption, right? I mean, like, certainly bribes and other ways of trying to influence politicians that way. Sure. Now it's, sure, corruption is still certainly a problem and can be an issue, but it's, in the age of mass media, it's not exactly corruption. It's more like, to what extent do more powerful voices have a bigger say? How much do the voices that are just putting out a bunch of, fake news out there and spending a lot of money on that? I mean, that's something that certainly there were partisan presses all throughout American history, but the ability to reach just a huge number of people now makes it a little bit different of a concern about where all this money is going and how it's being spent.
Yeah, Mike?
Yeah, I had a question, I think, for Tim and Paul on this. I'm wondering, the founders, we always talk about their split loyalty between like liberty, individualism, and the common good or virtue or something. And I'm just wondering, did any of them talk about elections as being part of the common good or wrapped up with virtue? Or were elections seen as just where individuals kind of fought it out to gain political power? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say that they saw elections almost in a quasi. It was almost like a civic celebration, because often election days were I mean, I just read some stuff today that when they were electing folks to the Virginia ratifying convention, it was like a whole month. They had rallies and parades and there's a lot of alcohol. So it was almost like a civic celebration that they saw it. And remember this idea of being unseemly. You stood for election. You didn't run for election. You had your friends, do the dirty work of the campaigning, and you wanted to stay aloof from that. But they're also sensitive to the corrupt. I mean, there was a lot of raised eyebrows when Washington was involved in the Potomac project. Should he be a shareholder? When Congress was considering spending money or investing public monies in that project. So they're very sensitive about the money issue if they had these commitments to appearing civically virtuous. So yeah, there's an awareness of the money corruption problem, but to your question directly, Mike, I think so.
Oh, Timmy, you locked up on the last point, Timmy.
They just saw it as a civic celebration. Yeah.
Well, so it seems to me, again, in some things I read, this really bubbles up as a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution. And what I found fascinating when it comes to campaign finance laws is that is one, just how many, at the national level they've been. My research showed that like 1907 and something called the Tillman Act was the first wide-ranging effort at controlling spending. But then we got 1910, 1911, 1925, 1939, 1943, 47, and then there seems to be a period where we think we found, I guess, the balance or so, and then 1971, and then post Watergate, and things like that, and that takes us up to Buckley versus Vallejo. And so, Paul and Chris, I'm hoping the two of you can kind of lay out for students kind of this evolution from Buckley, all right, 1976, and kind of its key findings and how it structures campaign finance until we get to Citizens United. And I don't know if that's kind of a fair parameter there, but that's how I read it, is from Buckley to Citizens United, we seem to have one system, and now we've got a completely different system. So if you can kind of lay out to kids, why did we get Buckley? What did Buckley do? And then Citizens United, if I think I'm right, kind of overturned a lot of Buckley. So Chris, Paul, what do you think?
I'll defer to the professor.
Well, so, I mean, Buckley, one thing that I'd really emphasize about Buckley is that really is the crucial case. I think nowadays you probably hear more about Citizens United, but really Buckley versus Vallejo was the crucial here, and Citizens United in many ways was just kind of an extension of that. So Buckley basically reshaped campaign finance law in the United States, and it did a couple of really important things. To kind of try to boil it down, was that the majority there, or at least most of the justices, in their opinion, they allowed contributions to candidates. So there are a bunch of limitations that campaign finance law put on contributions, individual contributions to candidates, but it struck down the expenditures by candidates. So in some ways it created a system sort of opposite to what Mike was talking about with the UK, where there's limits on how much people can contribute, but there's no limit on how much people can spend, or at least few limits there. And a lot of that had to do with interpretations of the First Amendment and balanced against concerns about corruption. So the way that they balanced that was by that basic holding, where the court said, sure, there's concerns about corruption. If I want to give $1 million to some candidate, then it's like that person's going to be in my pocket. So fine, there's a compelling interest why we might want to limit that. But when it comes to a candidate spending money, for their own purposes, well, that's First Amendment, that's free speech. They should be allowed to do it. So those sorts of limits were struck down. So in many ways, once we get to Citizens United, it was really, I consider that much less of a shot out of the blue than it was kind of a continuation of the logic of Buckley versus Vallejo back in 1976.
One thing I would add to what Professor Nolette said for the students is, I always found fascinating out of Buckley were the 8 magic words in the footnote, right? Which will allow for issue ads, right? And the idea is with issue ads, it's not supposed to be in favor of a candidate. Sometimes it's really hard to tell the difference. But as long as you don't say vote for or vote against, or you'd have to go to the footnote to see these 8 magic words, because once you use one of those 8 magic words, then that becomes a political ad and not an issue ad, even though the way they're written is it's very hard to tell the difference. So that's always fun. And I would also throw in McConnell versus FEC. I think McConnell versus FEC is the stepping stone to Citizens United, because that really is what's being challenged, is the ruling within McConnell versus FEC. and as this group comes forward and puts out the movie about, at that time, was it Senator Clinton, I think, right? And her inability, her lack of ability to be president, whether or not that's a campaign ad. So when you start to look at Citizens United, really what they're going after is McConnell versus the FEC, which is an interesting case on its own. But that's what I would add to that.
Well, I just as a side note, Chris, you can also get those magic words on a episode of West Wing when Bartlett's running for re-election. Sam Seaborn is in a conversation, and they bring up those 8 magic words with oh God, who was the campaign advisor? He's passed away now. I'm sorry, I'm getting sidetracked. So am I wrong then? Did Buckley not gut? Because I don't know how many articles I came across by those who criticize Citizens United say that Citizens United, one, gutted Buckley in so many ways, and two, makes it almost impossible for Congress to pass any kind of campaign finance reform that would make any effective difference in the political arena. Professor Nolette, so am I wrong on that? Was I reading just hyperbole, I guess, by the left or something?
Well, and I do think that those on the left kind of do overrate Citizens United to some degree. I mean, it was an important decision, landmark, no doubt about it. But I think really the ire should be at Buckley, Buckley versus Vallejo, not Citizens United. I don't see Citizens United as really, disemboweling Buckley. Certainly it did McConnell versus FEC, as Chris mentioned. But in many ways, it was a continuation of the logic of Buckley, where there was a real concern about people or corporations, in the case of Citizens United, spending money on issue ads.
This is why you never let a historian enter into political science discussions. But I kind of thought Citizens United was really bizarre because it added the notion that corporations were like people and therefore had the rights to these expenditures, this extension of this idea of political speech. So am I wrong on that it's out there on that?
Well, and I think that's where, a lot of the criticism, particularly on the left, was about the corporate spending. But at the same time, the idea of corporations as people, or at least corporations with constitutional rights, I mean, that goes back to the late 19th century, in court decisions where,
right.
they, in fact, corporations did have constitutional rights. And so that wasn't something particularly new either. Ultimately, I think it opened the door for quite a bit more spending that was independent of the parties. But, one of the points that, Kennedy makes in the majority is that the First Amendment doesn't make a distinction between, media corporations and other types of corporations. Of course, there's a freedom of the press that's specifically mentioned, but, like the New York Times is a corporation, and News Corporation is a corporation. So you have media corporations that are part of this too. I'm actually kind of, even though I'm not personally a particularly large fan of the Citizens United decision, I think that, when Alito kind of shook his head at, Obama saying this was a totally out of the blue decision and overturned all these years of precedent, I think in some ways Alito was kind of right, that the court had already set up the stage for dismantling campaign finance, and it really started with that Buckley decision. So, that's really the decision that I think critics of the courts and their treatment of campaign finance, that's the bigger deal than Citizens United, in my view.
Yeah, so Paul, you acknowledge that money is a problem in our system, but it seems to me that, to kind of my second point, that you seem to be implying that our hands are tied. as a political culture, our hands are tied when it comes to controlling money in politics. That from Buckley to Citizens United, including McConnell, that Congress really, because McCain-Feingold to me was a moderate approach. It wasn't a radical approach. It was a moderate approach to campaign finance reform. You seem to be implying we really can't do anything about the influence of money in politics. Am I right?
Well, I mean, I think when it comes to expenditure limits, I mean, that's something where I think the courts have drawn that big red line, saying that that's a violation of free speech if you put limits on how corporations or individuals can spend for issue ads, or how candidates themselves can spend money. So in some ways, the First Amendment is kind of tying the hands on some of the most important things that public finance reformers could do, which is, cut down on the spending. That I think is ultimately what would need to happen. I mean, there's still, citizens, even after Citizens United and other cases, there's still room for some public financing of elections. There's still some room for disclosure rules. And maybe that's where some of the energy needs to be, to really, maybe name and shame people who are funding campaigns that you find objectionable, and maybe there's some precedent for that now. You have, you had a bunch of corporations at least temporarily halt donations after January 6th, because they didn't want to be associated with those actions. I mean, I don't think that's going to last long, but maybe that's one way to kind of put some pressure on the donors of these campaigns to change. And maybe that's the next front in campaign finance.
Chris?
Well, I want to go back, and Professor Nolette had mentioned a couple of cases from the turn of the last century for students. Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad versus Chicago would be a good one to look at, as well as Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. I think the Santa Clara County one is one with the fences and counting defense posts and that ability. And part of it, that actually is, and I did, believe it or not, I did some research for this week. I know you're shocked, guys, on that, but that's where there's an implication. It doesn't say in the decision, but it's implied that the equal protection laws of the 14th Amendment could apply to corporations, right? So there is that in there. And I also did some digging. I know this is crazy, but I think the opinion in Citizens United totally misrepresents the founders' views on corporations. Because as I was reading, the founders there's a difference between how they treated corporations and giving them some type of identity so they could exist in a courtroom setting, not necessarily as a person with rights. So I think the opinion in Citizens totally misrepresents the founders' views on corporations. And for the students watching, I would also tell you to take a look at McCutcheon versus the FEC, which is a follow-up. That's in 2014. And that's where you look at the aggregate totals that you can give. It's getting a little knee deep in the weeds in terms of campaign finance, but take a look at that. And you need to look at HR 1, for the People Act of 2021, because it talks about no longer being able to necessarily hide that money. Right, the idea that we should be able to know who's donating that money, which I think is important. So because what's the language the Kennedy uses? Corruption or the appearance of corruption, I think, is the language he uses. Which is like, are you kidding me? Because and for the students, one more thing. Sorry, Jane Mayer, Dark Money. Check it out. It's really, really good. And she also has a very current piece in the Atlantic where she was able to get a recording of the representative of the Koch brothers and wanting to kill HR 1 because the fear is that they will no longer be able to have dark money that cannot be traced to the donors. And so they're working on trying to get that killed in the Senate. So, I mean, the idea of corruption and the appearance of corruption, that just frosts my granola, I think, because it clearly is the idea of at least the appearance of corruption.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Williams, is there any hope here as far as limiting? And again, I want to go back. Limiting candidates spending means nothing with all this dark money. In fact, you don't have to raise anything for your campaign if you've got these other entities out there spending all this money, kind of thing. So I just is there, in your opinion, Mike, is there any chance for us to ever rein this in other than revolution?
Well, of course, revolution's always on the table. So, no, I mean, I'd say I think the ability for Congress to act through these Supreme Court decisions has been super, super limited. I mean, McCutcheon was kind of, if Citizens United was on the one side and McCutcheon's on the other, in terms of now individuals can give more, there can't be an aggregate cap, and corporations can spend, there's the dark money. No, I'm pretty negative that in terms of a congressional response, I think it's limited in what Congress could do with the current Supreme Court, right? I do think the students should think about two things: federalism, right? There's a lot that can be done at the state level, and things that could be experimented at the state level. There's been Arizona's done some things, New Mexico's done some things, and maybe that's a place to start thinking about policy changes. I also just wanted to add, in terms of American exceptionalism, this is an issue where we are exceptional. I mean, with most rich democratic countries in the world, either limit spending and contributions, or don't limit the contributions, but limit the spending. I found that it was us and Finland that had limits on contributions, but not on spending. And now with McCutcheon, that seems like that's kind of gone. So now we are with Australia and Switzerland. But they then have some element of they have some element of controlling TV time. So it's really, when you look at other rich democratic countries, the way we do this is really, really different than what a lot of the other countries are doing.
So we're coming to the end of our segment, gentlemen. And so what I'd like to do is kind of going back to polarization, and I think it is interrelated. What's your recommendation? How do we get out of this? All right, what's got to happen? One might argue after 1968, 71, and maybe we give all the credit to Reagan. Chris, control yourself there. But that polarization of the late 60s, early 70s, eventually we could blame disco as well there for, mind numbing the entire country there. But what would you suggest to students as far as, how do we get out of this? And can we get out of this? What has to happen for us to get out of this period? Paul, I'll give you a few minutes to think about that, because we're going to rely on you to kind of be our, number 4 hitter here. So, Mr. Kavanaugh, what would you recommend? How do we get out of this? And
I was going to say, wait for all the old white Republicans to die, but I don't know that would be appropriate. So,
and here's my problem, and again, it's funny, your answer is a polarized answer. So what about getting rid of AOC?
What about
it just can't be Republicans are the problem, and that. I understand that Mann and Ornstein will say they're predominantly to blame, but they also focus on the Democratic Party and their contribution. So,
well, yeah. David, let's be honest. If 75% of the people want some type of common sense gun reform, why don't we have it? If 75% of the people or more want some type of immigration reform, why don't we have it? If the majority of people want these things, and as Mike said earlier, they want government to come in and do these things, why doesn't the government do it? And I'm going to tell you right now, the reason the government doesn't do it is because it's not in big money's favor. It's not in the favor of some people that actually control the purse strings for big money. What has Mitch McConnell done for the state of Kentucky? Look where the state of Kentucky ranks nationally. So in so many categories, they're at the bottom of everything, yet they keep re-electing this guy. Why?
Okay, I live in California, and if you want me to rant on Democratic representatives there, oh, Mike's got something flying across the screen. I can't filibuster. Oh, really? That's the answer? Get rid of the filibuster or take it back to its pure form, Dr. Williams? Is that your solution?
No, I don't want to cut you off. I mean, I think it's
save me, Mike. Save me for myself.
No, to get to Chris's point, we know why the gun law didn't pass during Obama's administration. They had the majority votes. They had 70. It was the filibuster, and I think you can say the same thing about immigration. I mean, I think it's partially in jest, but it's partially like, yeah. I mean, we are not a majority rules country, and the filibuster even makes it even more difficult. Like, we have to be a super majority rule country, and that's hard for democracies, and it's hard for a country like us that is becoming more diverse. We're becoming a different country, so I think some of those institutional things could make a difference. Yes.
Professor Moore, give us a 1790s perspective.
I'm struck by Paul. This is where I get to be the curmudgeon, and because I hear. I mean, your question was, how do we get out of this? I don't know. We sort. I think political scientists use that word all the time. We self-segregate. We sort. I mean, the most segregated hour of the week is 10 o'clock on Sunday. We sort ourselves out residentially. We sort ourselves out in who we date. We isolate. And so I don't see, I take a dim view of a political solution to get us out of this. There was an interview, actually the Humanities North Dakota did an interesting program a couple of days ago I watched. And the gentleman that they interviewed had a lot of interesting things to say. And one of the things he said is, because he was asked a similar question, he said he wasn't sure, and maybe it just confirms my bias, but he didn't see a political solution. And he said, what will have to happen is people will have to concede that politics cannot be your identity. And it may be going across town. It may be going to the Lincoln Tap. It may be sitting around a fire pit with somebody you think is nuts. It may be finding ways to not silo other than politics. I think it's hard to demonize somebody that's a dear friend who shares a different perspective politically. So I guess, I mean, I hear a lot of discussion about the getting out of the political component to get us out of this. I don't know that I share that optimism. I think it's more of a cultural answer I'm trying to articulate to get out of this.
Dr. Nolette?
Well, I might give a slightly more politic version of what Chris said, in that I do think ultimately what will actually change things is one party kind of breaking through and becoming, at least for a period of time, the dominant party, kind of like, during FDR's time and the Great Depression. We've had so many years of this close combat, between the parties, with each winning these incremental victories, that I think it's tough to break out of polarization in that context. I think it's going to take a big shock, and I think the most likely one, just based upon trends, would be, the Democrats at some point getting pretty large majorities, at least on the national level in many states, where Republicans just have to change in order to maintain power. And I base that based on, you look at millennials and the most recent generations, like Democrats with 30-point edges amongst those groups. I mean, the Republicans are going to get wiped out if that continues. And a lot of political science research indicates that particularly once you hit your mid-20s, you don't change your political alliances. So it's kind of a myth that people get super conservative as they get older. In fact, they actually maintain their allegiances. So it's I think that's the only thing that can really change it. I think on the margins, Tim, I think nicely talked about kind of on the mass public level, talking to friends who you think are crazy and being willing to do those conversations, I think is important. I do think that on the elite side, there's a responsibility there, and maybe, politicians can play some role here. And I would point to, I think that's actually kind of Joe Biden's strategy in his first 100 days here is try to make things, quite unlike his predecessor, don't make things about yourself, kind of stay out of the limelight and focus on things that are popular, COVID-19 checks, infrastructure. I think that can, don't take the bait with Mr. Potato Head, things like that. Stay out of it and just focus on the bread and butter things people care about and show that government can work. And I think that's his strategy, and that's not going to solve all the problems by any means, but I do think that can be a start from the political elite level at tamping down some of the passions and polarization that we've seen explode in the last few years.
I'm sorry, I'm going to dovetail here, but I think when Paul mentions the most recent round of the COVID relief checks, right, which were, as I understand, most opinion polls, the majority of people were very much in favor of, right, Republican and Democrat, and yet Biden could not get any Republicans in Congress to go with him on this. And I think, I'm really curious to see how that plays out, right? When they're trying to just stonewall him on everything, like they tried to do to Obama on a lot of things. So, but when you come up with a piece of legislation that is wildly popular, how will that play? So I'm curious to see how that will play out.
And one just quick thing that I'd mention on that point that I find interesting with Biden is that he's really trying to redefine bipartisanship. Because, he's kind of describing the COVID bill as a bipartisan bill, even though Republicans didn't vote for it, because he said, that's just one piece of it. And in fact, I did what both Democrats and Republicans agree is the right policy. So it's a bipartisan policy. So he's not defining it by political elites, but instead defining it by how, Republicans and the mass public think about this stuff.
Yeah, can I add, I know we want to close up, but I just, the question was, how do we get out of this? I think it's a top down and a bottom up things that come together. I think what we're just discussing is the top down. I really do think that most Americans have not seen government work for them. They think of they think of our failures, the Great Recession, 9/11. And if Biden can get this stuff done, it's going to set up a whole new generation of trust, I think, with government. And then the bottom up part of this for me about polarization is if more Americans participated, we wouldn't maybe get the type of political elites we're getting. If my hypothesis is right, that most Americans are in the middle, right? But what's happening is most Americans who come out and vote in primaries and in general are not in the middle. They're on the extremes, and that's driving who gets elected to office. If more of us come out and vote and demand that we have candidates who are kind of like what Tim's talking about, maybe a little more moderate, they're willing to talk, that bottom-up strategy along with having more trust in government, I think that could be what would then change the attitudes, which would then change the notions of political culture. But
ranked choice voting.
Yeah, there's a lot out there, and just a little pushback on Dr. Williams. We just had one of the largest turnouts in the last 60 years, and in total numbers, which doesn't mean anything, So it was in many ways the most polarized election, that we've had. So
we
got Joe Biden. We didn't get Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders.
But how are you defining polarization there? Biden won he won by the biggest margin.
70 million people voted for the most polarizing figure in American history. That's
That
how I'm
doesn't mean-
defining it.
But that doesn't mean that all 70 million agreed with all of his polarizing ideas.
Well, all 80 million didn't agree with President Biden either. I mean, that's not the point.
No,
The point is, we can keep this going. Obviously,
Hey, Tim, you checked the score of the game lately?
You're
all
saying
right,
Trump and Biden are not the same political figures, right? I mean, it's not like AOC was running against Trump. So you can't tell me like you can't do that.
of course, I can do it. Whether I should do it
It's
is,
1-0
of course,
in the
another
top of
question.
the sixth. And Tim, it's 1-0 in the top of the sixth. Cubbies up 1.
All right, students and teachers.
Yeah, I see that. Top of 6. Cubbies are up.
Yeah. Students and teachers, we're going to bring this to an end. We may have planted some seeds for some topics in the future. In fact, I wanted to suggest for those of you who view this segment that if you have ideas and you have needs or you have recommendations, don't hesitate to have your teacher contact us. And we're pretty much, I think if you've noticed, we're willing to talk about pretty much anything that deals with history and politics and the Constitution. So we appreciate your viewing, and hopefully we've been able to help you gain some insights. We want to personally thank Dr. Nolette for his joining us tonight, and we do hope that Marquette is now on the road to recovery in college basketball. And so hopefully we'll see you soon, and we'll continue our conversation. So peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye, bye-byes.